Okay, so today we're going to dive into Brené Brown's Daring Greatly.
Okay.
Um, and you share this with us, looking to kind of quickly grasp the core idea of how to live a more courageous and connected life.
Right.
And I think this is really interesting for anyone who's a learner,
Absolutely.
because one of the things that I think is really important as learners is that
Okay.
we're willing to be vulnerable in our learning process, and that's a big part of what this book is about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's so fascinating about Brene Brown's work is that it challenges this idea that we have as a society that vulnerability is weakness.
Hmm.
And instead, she flips it on its head and says, actually, vulnerability is the birthplace of courage, of innovation, creativity,
Right.
of change, all those things.
So let's dive into what vulnerability actually means then, because I think a lot of people hear that word and think weakness.
Right. And I think that's the common misconception that Brene Brown really tries to change in our minds. And so for her, vulnerability is not about, oversharing or being weak or, sort of putting all your dirty laundry out there. It's really about the courage to show up and be seen when there's no guarantee of outcome.
Right.
And so it's really about being willing to put yourself out there,
Yeah.
and sort of, risk that judgment.
And risk failure.
And risk failure, exactly.
Absolutely.
And one of her most famous quotes is, vulnerability is the birthplace of innovation, creativity, and change.
Right.
So really allowing yourself to enter that arena and really, be okay with being seen
Right.
with all your imperfections and all your messiness.
I love that. And she also emphasizes the difference between shame and guilt.
Yes.
And I think that's really important for us to kind of dive into and break down.
Absolutely. And why that's so important is that they have very different impacts on us.
Right.
Right? Guilt is, that feeling of, I did something bad, which can actually be constructive. It can help us to, course correct our behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Shame, on the other hand, is that feeling of, I am bad.
Yeah.
I am a bad person. And that is so disruptive. And our research shows that, shame isolates us,
Yeah.
whereas vulnerability and self-compassion
Right.
are the antidotes to shame.
Okay.
So, thinking about it in terms of learning something new, if you make a mistake, are you saying to yourself, oh, I messed up, I need to understand this better?
Right.
Or are you saying, oh, I'm just not smart enough?
Right.
Those are two very different places to be coming from.
It's either guilt or shame.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And recognizing that distinction is so important for us to move forward.
That makes total sense. And this all kind of, I guess, relates back to this idea of not enough, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Not
Right.
skilled enough, not knowledgeable enough, all of those things that we sometimes struggle with.
That scarcity mindset, right?
Right.
That I'm not enough really undermines our ability to experience joy and reach our potential.
Right.
And she contrasts this with what she calls wholehearted living.
Yeah.
And wholehearted living is about recognizing your inherent worthiness, believing that you are enough right here, right now, imperfections and all. And this isn't about complacency.
Right.
It's about operating from a place of self-acceptance rather than constantly chasing, some unattainable ideal.
Yeah.
And so, it's really powerful to think about what might shift for you if you truly embrace the idea that you are already worthy.
Absolutely. And this goes beyond our personal lives as well.
Yeah.
I mean, she even looks at this in leadership and parenting.
Right.
So how does this look in professional setting or even in families?
Yeah. So in leadership, vulnerability is not about liking authority.
Okay.
It's about building trust through open communication,
Right.
a willingness to acknowledge mistakes,
Right.
leaders who are willing to be human,
Yeah.
create a safer environment for innovation and risk-taking.
Right.
Similarly, in parenting, when we model vulnerability, showing our kids that it's okay to struggle or be imperfect. Right.
We help them develop resilience
Yeah.
and the courage to face their own challenges. If we're constantly presenting this flawless image,
Yeah.
it can inadvertently teach them that vulnerability is something to hide.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so for you, our listener, the key takeaways here are that vulnerability is a strength, not a weakness.
Exactly.
Sharing your stories, being seen, helps to combat shame.
Mm.
Letting go of the I'm not enough myth and embracing your worthiness is essential.
Yeah.
And this idea of vulnerability extends into how we lead and how we parent.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So Daring Greatly really reframes vulnerability for us. It asks us to see it not as something to shield ourselves from, but as the very path to a more connected, courageous, and ultimately more confident life.
I love consider this. Then think about one area in your life where you tend to hold back, where being open feels risky.
Mhm.
What's one small daring step you could take to be a little more vulnerable in that space? What might you discover? Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
Thanks for having me.